All right. You know, I do get a lot of pleasure out of teaching these humanities classes. I really like introducing people to things that I think are good things to know about. And, a lot of the students have heard of plenty of things before, some have not. There's always a steady stream of people saying, oh, that was really nice to find out about that. And of course, I enjoy finding out about things myself. Now, I mean, as a humanities teacher, I'm not teaching off some sort of list of the required books or something. There are basics that I cover. Obviously we just did Leonardo and Michelangelo. I mean, there's some things that can't be got around, but I'm not in any way a cynical teacher of humanities. I'm only teaching you stuff that I really like. I show you paintings that I think are cool paintings. I mean, we could look at a lot of different paintings. I show you writings, novels that I think are cool novels, and so on. Um, and so on with everything. Everything that I show you is stuff that I really believe in, and it's really brought a lot of pleasure into my own life. The reason I talk about that a little bit at the beginning of the video today is because today I'm going to do Cervantes and Cervantes' novel, Don Quixote. And that is really one of the cultural touchstones for me. I mean, it's an easy one because it's one of the cultural touchstones for the entire European tradition. It's one of the most important prose works in the world, in history, and certainly in the history of the novel. And it really, to this day, I think is really quite astonishing in its modernity and in its depth. So so getting to that then, um, and having made the point that it is a special day for me because this is a book that I've already read twice and I plan to read again, and I've read about it and I've taught it, and I just think it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. So I really, like a day like that. That's a good day when you get to talk about stuff like that. All right, so we are going to talk today about uh, Cervantes. I'm saying he's a traveler between worlds. I think he's a traveler between many worlds. So what's my goal today with talking about Cervantes? What can I bring to this? What I want to talk about today is Cervantes at a sort of abstract level. I want to talk about, if somebody says, well, why is Miguel Cervantes such a great writer? I mean, is it just the quality of the prose? Is it the historic time and place is very, very important. But there is also, I guess I've been hesitating to use the word philosophical, but there's a sort of philosophical dimension. I just want to show you what it is that Cervantes is doing that I think gets at what's such a big deal about his work, Don Quixote. Uh, and as I say, I think Cervantes himself kind of a traveler between worlds. So I have a pretty specific goal, is to sort of get at uncover another layer of Cervantes here. Now, this slide is the second slide in this video and in my video for Shakespeare, Literary Titans at the Dawn of the Baroque. And as a student, here's a little tip. Shakespeare and Cervantes. Shakespeare, arguably the most important writer in the English language. Certainly one of the top handful of important writers in the English language. Cervantes, arguably the most important writer in the Spanish language. Without any doubt, one of the sort of small handful of most important writers ever to this day in the Spanish language. Okay, good. But listen, Shakespeare and Cervantes live at almost exactly the same time. So it's a twofer. That is, if you can just remember that Shakespeare and Cervantes overlap each other almost perfectly, then whatever you know about one in terms of when they were, you know about the other. They've died within 10 days of each other. Actually, they officially they both died on the same date in April, but the Spanish had the Gregorian calendar at that time, so they actually died 10 days apart in April of 1616. They started writing almost exactly the same time. Of course, Shakespeare a much bigger output than Cervantes, but Cervantes did publish something in the beginning of the 1590s, and that's when Shakespeare starts his regular work and doing his thing. And they both stop writing about the same time. So, and now what time is that? Okay, because now you have something. Now you know that Shakespeare and Cervantes both lived at the same time, almost exactly the same time. And when is that? That's at the turn of the century, from the 1500s to the 1600s, from the 16th century to the 17th century. The 17th century, the 1600s, is the Baroque, the period of the Baroque. And Shakespeare and Cervantes open that period. Behind them, and this for both for literature and history is important. In the case of Cervantes, you have what was called the Siglo del Oro, the golden century of drama. So you have all kinds of plays being produced all the time. Of course, obviously, same thing going on with William Shakespeare in his milieu. And then you also have for Cervantes the so-called picaresque novels and other things. We'll talk about them actually as we go along here. And then in the case of Shakespeare, we have right now Queen Elizabeth II is the lady with the corgis on the throne. She's been there for an awfully long time. But Elizabeth I was in the 1500s after Henry VIII died, and she was a really great queen who was queen of England for a really long time. And there was all sorts of flourishing culture because she was very liberal-minded. Things have to be good sometimes. And so that's coming off that Elizabethan period, which was a really good period. You get William Shakespeare coming into the Baroque. So as I say, put Shakespeare and Cervantes together. Remember, they lived at the same time, and it's easier to find your way around some stuff. So let's just go through. Now, this is not the novel. This is Cervantes' own life. Cervantes had an amazing life, and he was a fairly tough person, even later in life. I mean, he was obviously a bit of a roughneck. It says that he worked for the government. He was a tax collector. I mean, you fill in. His father, the family was a good family, a family with a name, as it were. But their father wasn't so great, and he lost his money several times and had to move around and actually spent a couple of years in prison for debt, leaving his wife and 5 children. So that was a colorful childhood that he had. He apparently injured someone badly dueling when he was 22 and had to run away to Italy so as not to be arrested. He probably hoped to be able to get back in the good graces of Spain, which eventually worked when he joined the Spanish Navy in Naples. They were putting together the fleet, the Holy League fleet, which fought with the Ottoman Empire fleet in the Battle of Lepanto, which is actually a really important battle. It was the largest naval engagement of its time, with over 4,000 ships. It was the last big battle where a substantial part of the fleet was oar-driven. After that, you had sail-driven battle almost exclusively. And it was a turning point in the struggle with the Ottoman Empire, which was not going well at that time, actually. That was a militarily bad point for the West. And he was very badly wounded. Cervantes very badly wounded at the Battle of Lepanto. In fact, 2 years later, we are still reading that he had abdominal wounds, still not entirely healed, and he never was able to use his left arm again. He went on, though, in military service. He was an officer, he's a man who's a bit of a gentleman, but a gentleman from a family that doesn't have any money, but he's got an education. He's an officer. He's in the occupation of Tunis. He's moving around until he's sailing back to Spain in 1575, when the Barbary pirates, who are Islamic pirates from the north coast of Spain, who were around for a long time. Teddy Roosevelt actually faces down the Barbary pirates around the time of the Spanish-American War. He's captured at sea and taken prisoner. He is not made a slave because, again, he's an officer and a gentleman, as they say. So he is held for ransom, he and his brother. The family manages to ransom out the brother before they can do Miguel. He apparently tried to escape several times. By all accounts, he was always a very honorable soldier. Again, obviously very tough. And he eventually was, after 5 years in captivity, and this is a man then also who speaks Arabic, he returns and then goes back again out to North Africa as an intelligence agent, a spy essentially. His family connections then and his acquittal of himself get him a job in the custom house as a purchasing agent, and then later as a tax collector, all places where, you weren't supposed to take too much. And apparently he was put in jail a couple of times for graft for that. Always having this dream. Cervantes always had this dream that he could make money writing plays. He just was sure that he could do it. He tried to write a few things. His father was almost certainly a bad alcoholic. Who knows what the deal was with Cervantes. He does get married to a much younger woman in there after he returns. In any event, he publishes part one of Don Quixote in 1605. It's a big success. Um, he finally has a little money. Everything's fine. And again, it's quite like him that years are going by and he's not writing anything else until an imposter writes a sequel, which makes him mad and also makes him a little worried. And then he does write his own sequel in 1615. So, I mean, his output is not big, although there are a couple of other interesting writings by him. Don Quixote is not the only thing worth reading by Cervantes. Sigmund Freud actually claimed that he learned Spanish in order to read Cervantes, and he wanted to read one of the other novels, in fact, according to what I saw there. So anyway, Cervantes, a very worldly person indeed. The story of the novel, which is really called El Ingenioso, the ingenious Hidalgo gentleman, Don Quixote de La Mancha. La Mancha, the stain, of course, that means. And La Mancha, I mean, it's like in Indiana Jones, okay? So Indiana, I mean, Indiana is just cornfields. It's a joke that he's Indiana Jones. The great adventurer comes from Indiana, which is the middle of nowhere. And La Mancha is a town up in these northern plains of Castile. It's like that. La Mancha, the stain, the spot on the map. He comes from nowhere. Old Alonso Quijano, an old Hidalgo, an old man, an old titled man, but he's an old man who has a little apartment in a little village now, Don Alonso. And he's read so many chivalric romances that he's kind of dried his brain. A superficial reading of Don Quixote is that it's a satire of chivalric romances and therefore is making fun of people stuck in the past as the new Baroque world is ushered in. But that's a very reductive and simplistic reading, actually, of Cervantes. He's actually after something, I think, quite a bit deeper than that in his exploration of our identity and the way that our identity is kind of smeared across the past and the future. Also, he is making fun of picaresque novels. Picaresque novels, chivalric romances are like romance stories that polite young ladies read chivalric fantasy novels about the knights and stuff. It's for, ladies. And then like romance novels. And then you have these picaresque novels, which are about roving scalawags and rogues out in the highways and having all sorts of Tom Jones kind of adventures. And that's more kind of street pamphlet stuff for a slightly different crowd, a little bit racier. And that's involved here too. And then you also have Italian novellas. That's where the word novella comes from, Italy, of course. And there, as we think of novellas in terms of Latin soap operas today. It's the same kind of stuff, and that's all stuff that's at work here. But from that starting point, I mean, what's happened to Don Alonso is that he's read so much of these chivalric romances that he's decided that he's a knight and he's going to live by the chivalric code. Um, and one of the ladies in the village says Sancho Panza, Panza meaning fat belly. He's short with a fat belly. Sancho. Apparently, there was slang that Sancho was the guy who pretends to be your friend, but he really wants your woman, which would fit because Sancho is kind of gullible himself. So, of course, it's Sancho, the man of the earth, who responds to Don Quixote's ravings from these chivalric novels with simple folk sayings, peasant sayings. But he's not. But Sancho also is very greedy. Don Quixote wants to go off and supposedly give his life for his chivalric code. But Sancho Panza isn't like that. Sancho Panza is out for whatever he can get. Um, Wherever they go, they cause a lot of trouble. And I think that Don Quixote is kind of, it's like having sort of a rip in the space time continuum or something. I mean, there's just no way that Don Quixote is going to be able to live in this world. He can't live in this world. But now we finally come to what I think is the real theme. And I think about mirrors and lenses and things. Um, can can you live in this world? Don Quixote is not of this world. He's awkward. He looks funny, and he's disruptive, and he gets in fights all the time. He doesn't know how to deal with people. He can't sit down, and he's so maladjusted he can't have an ordinary conversation. But again, the thing that dawns on you after a while, after it's too late to get away, is that the book is a mirror. Now, at the time, readers, and I suppose readers today, perhaps in the Spanish-speaking world, uh, maybe some young fellas reading, you have all this slapstick. You have the scene where they're throwing Sancho Panza up and down in a blanket. The people after Don Quixote's run off on the bill or something, and they're always getting beat up badly. I mean, and ending up by the side of the road. But I mean, but it reads as slapstick at one level. At first approaching you can see it's just goofy. Unless you come at it as a strongly empathetic person in the first place, in which case you're going to see it as kind of tragic, rough. But both of those responses are going to be put through some dialectical changes by Cervantes, no matter what. He's way ahead of you. He wants you to see through Don Quixote's displacement. Don Quixote does not belong in this space and time. But then some of the space and time that he thinks he belongs to is imaginary. So, and then, I mean, at the very end of it, when he finally realizes once and for all that the vecinos, the neighbors in the village, are now patronizing him and calling him Don Quixote and pretending he's Don Quixote, and he sees that he's not. But that's when he dies. I mean, when he comes back to reality, that's when he perishes because he's more of a fictional character than he is a real person. Except, actually, by the way, the real person I'm referring to here is the real person of Don Alonso Quijano, who's a fictional character. So the idea is that I'm a real person, he's a fictional character, but he's a real person in the book, where when he realizes that he's not a fictional character, he dies. That means he was really more of a fictional character than he was the real person that he was, except that he was a fictional character. See what I mean? And remember this when we get also to Velasquez, the painter, who I believe is influenced by Cervantes. So he rides off on Rocinante. There's lots of puns all through the book. Rocinante means sort of an old workhorse. A Rocin is an old workhorse or an old working man who's kind of beat up. Old Rocin. All right. So And so if, I mean, there's a lot about sort of breaking down dualities going on in Cervantes. So the long, elongated Quixote, who is selfless, he thinks, and he wants to just devote his life. He thinks he's got lots of things that are more important than his life. He's lofty, he's up in the sky. Sancho Panza down near the ground, and he doesn't have any interest in any of that kind of. He thinks that Don Quixote is just crazy, and he's right, I guess. But then, are these sort of the two parts of soul? Are these sort of the two parts of soul of everybody? Is this what we look like uh, like Winnie the Pooh and Roo? Well, how does he, get this effect? I mean, so there's kind of a through the mirror effect of sort of flickering back and forth. And then you think that you had the polarity figured out, and then he breaks the polarity down in you. And I want to talk about that more. So about 20% of the population of the southern end of the southern half of the Iberian Peninsula at this time were conversos, and as well as people who had been converted from Islam. But the conversos were people who converted from Judaism. And originally, the Spanish Inquisition was really about keeping some kind of political control, riding political herd on these people whose loyalty was questioned. And there were a lot of people who were conducting other kinds of religious services in private and so on. So Cervantes does come down from Jewish family. I mean, we that's documented for sure on his father's side, and also probably on his mother's side. His name isn't that, by the way, and his name wasn't Saavedra, but he added that on later. So first of all, you have rich territory for a novelist. Certainly, you have a person who has a dual identity, including a public identity and a private identity, and a person who is a gentleman in a society, but maybe also has a sense of being not quite of the society. He's gentry, and it shows. It shows in his manner. It shows in his dress. But his family doesn't have any money, so because of his father. So in that sense, he's also sort of a classic character in a Spanish or English novel of these centuries. Um, and he's very tempestuous. Uh, so that fourth bullet point, as I say, there's two things here. That one is um, Don Quixote has lost his bearings, and it's also because of this change from the old to the new. It's the changing from the old world to the new world, and sort of Janus faced looking back to the old world and looking forward to the future, but not having a favoritism, I don't think, of either one of those things. And Don Quixote is sort of displaced by this. He's displaced as being a representative of the past in the future. Um, but then again, that's the trick. The trick is seeing that what he's talking about is the human condition. He's talking about the way that all people are. And he tricks us by getting us to make fun of Don Quixote and to see Don Quixote as ridiculous, absurd, until it finally dawns on us. And so Don Quixote is tragicomic. Tragicomic, you have to laugh at life, or you can cry. You can cry, you can laugh. You're going to have to do one or the other. You can start by laughing because it's funny slapstick, and maybe you're just not evolved enough and you just think it's funny that they're getting beat up by these villagers because they keep making mistakes and getting in fights with the wrong people and chasing horses around, goats around, and stuff. But then, if you were sensitive, you might start to be, a little dismayed by these terribly mean human beings who just beat up strangers and can't handle weird people. But then after a while, you're going to have to laugh. I mean, you're just going to have to laugh because it's just so hopeless. And it is funny. But then at the end of the day, especially if you're thinking about it in terms of yourself, because we're all Don Quixote, right? We all have a goal. We all want to live according to what? Some wonderful code that we have about ourselves. People who call themselves revolutionaries. Don Quixote can't tell. And look, and notice the engraving here. Don Quixote is the countryman who comes. He sees, in this case, it's a marionette show, like maybe a Punch and Judy show, but he can't tell the difference between that and reality. He thinks someone's really being assaulted, so the brave knight rises. And in Don Quixote, the scene is, of course, also real actors on a stage, and Don Quixote has no idea that they're actors on a stage. He can't tell that. That's repeated in Mark Twain and a number of other literary sources that get it from Quixote. So yeah, I mean, that's the trick of it. The trick of it is reeling you in. And again, I think the thing is also that it all goes in both ways. Cervantes doesn't think that the past is worse than the future. The future is going to be better than the past. But he doesn't think that the future is worse than the past. He's not naive about how terrible the past was. It's the one and the many. And so you think of past and present because, I mean, I think the most basic literary criticism take on Don Quixote is this notion of the past and the present, but also fiction and reality. And as a playwright or someone steeped in a theatrical sort of milieu where playwriting, obra del teatro, were sort of first genre, right? And writing these long prose pieces like this is pioneering for Cervantes. Cervantes more of a formal pioneer that way than Shakespeare, who's writing plays and sonnets. Cervantes also writing sonnets, which are highly esteemed, by the way. So fiction, reality, and then looking through that fourth wall in the theater or TV, we say looking through the fourth wall when the character turns to the audience and addresses the audience directly and aside to the audience, breaking the fourth wall. Cervantes does that to kind of show that we're sort of lost. We don't even know what's representation, what's fiction, and what's reality. Don Quixote doesn't know that, but ordinary people don't know that either. In a sense, maybe that's really interesting. Reason why Don Quixote might be an important novel for us, because we are having problems with reality, aren't we? And people being in touch with reality or not in touch with reality. And Cervantes is all about questioning this concept of reality. I mean, in a way, so you have your identity that's given to you, but then you have what you learn from experience. Idealism, materialism, comedy, tragedy, fate, freedom. And they don't line up with this past and present. They flicker. They flicker back and forth like binary stars. And we can see it in the one and in the other. We can see it in our fantasy self and in our real self. We can see that we can make a mental construction that we have a fantasy self and that we have a real self, but that they're both constructions. If I have imposter syndrome, so I always feel like a little bit of imposter somehow, some other side that's an outsider, is that real? Is that the real one? So is it funny or is it death? Well, it's both. And of course, the windmills actually at the time, early 17th century, early 1600s, a symbol of technology coming down from the Low Countries and these new mills using windmill power to grind was new technology. So we know that Cervantes is interesting because he uses meta-narrative tricks that are modern in a sense, even like modernist or I don't like the word, but writers who came, let's just say, after the modernist movement do meta-narrative tricks, breaking the fourth wall. And Cervantes does this at the beginning of the 16th century. So, well, Cervantes is really something special. But I think when we look at what he wants to do is kind of force our own egos and our own sense of self to kind of disintegrate a little bit as he shows us on this margin between our own reality and our own mental constructions and our own historical displacements. And so I think that explains the meta narrative tricks a little bit. I mean, there's a reason for them because he wants to get this kind of Alice through the looking glass kind of sensation that we're no longer really aware of sort of which one's the real one and which one's the one that's not real. One thing he does, which is characteristic also of Russian literature for the same kinds of reasons, is the story is framed. He says there was an old Arabic text that somebody told me about, and not only that, but we realize after a while, I mean, it has been frequently said by critics that the three characters are Don Quixote, Sancho Panza, and Cervantes, because you have this narrator who's around and who's not Don Quixote or Sancho Panza at all. But you come to realize after a while that that narrator too is telling you is maybe mistaken about things. Maybe you disagree with what they're saying, and you're not sure about what their attitude is towards Don Quixote. Then he starts doing things. His first work, La Galatea, he tried to write poetry. He wasn't very good at it. He's got it. Don Alonso has got a copy of his own book. Another person who's influenced by Cervantes is Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentine short story writer who plays exactly the kinds of narrative tricks here that Cervantes does. And Cervantes is one of Borges' culture gods for sure. There's a funny book burning scene. The priest knows all the naughty bits of the books as he throws them into the fire. But you also get a bunch of discussion of Cervantes' opinions of various writers in various books as he decide whether to burn them or not. And then remember the second part of Don Quixote, part 2, which is published 10 years later. So there's quite a bit of evolution going on in the writer there. But also someone published a phony one. And so in that part 2, he's got a lot more of these meta-narrative tricks. He's much more self-conscious. Avellaneda, I believe is how you would pronounce the name of the man who forged it. That was his pen name. And Cervantes actually incorporated parts of that into the second part, which is a very, as I say, Borgian kind of thing to do, because then, well, what is the real Quixote? Jorge Luis Borges has a short story called something about the Quixote, where he's writing the Don Quixote. He's writing Don Quixote word for word. That's all I know. That's all I remember. It's crazy. And in fact, Avellaneda makes an appearance in the second part. Writing by a printing shop. You see the second part. We're in the second part, right? We're reading the second part. And in the second part, they go writing by a printing shop. And in there, you see the second part laid up on the print press, getting ready for printing. But then it hasn't been printed yet. But then we're reading something that hasn't been printed yet. Or at least in the world inside the book, and so on and so on. You get it. This is what he does. And this kind of flipping back and forth. And again, why do that? Is it just clever? No, it's because the larger issue of the book is the sense in which our own identity is always flipping back and forth, depending on our context, and that history is always pulling us sort of out from underneath our feet. It's always changing. It's moving too fast. The last thing I want to say is about you have a general critique, if I may go so far, by Cervantes of the way in which, on both a personal and a social level, we create these identities, we create these conventions, and his view is very corrosive to that. And he's warning us that it's not so easy to think you're sort of stepping through a door, leaving the past behind, and walking out into some sort of glorious future. I see three different parts of the book that get at what I would say is a sort of mini application of this. Because what does Cervantes have? He has clarity about the difference between the image and the reality, but also clarity about the great danger and perhaps even the impossibility of avoiding falling down those cracks between image and reality. And what better example than this sort of socially constructed image of women or fetishized image of women versus the reality? Because Don Quixote, remember, is in a dream, but he's walking around in a very rough reality out in this very rough countryside. So there's an interlude where they hear about Chrysostomos and the spurned lover of Marcella, and how he couldn't bear to live after Marcella turned him down. And they're at his grave. They're digging the grave to put Chrysostomos's body down in the grave because he's died now because he couldn't have Marcella. But the real Marcella, that is the character Marcella, appears and gives us this incredible speech, a defiance, in which she says that it was certainly never her idea for these men to romanticize her this way. She says, even if she is good looking, that's not her fault. She says they've been saying all these terrible things about her, but she never wanted any part of this. Why are they bringing her into all this? And then she marches off. In fact, she marches off into the woods, never to be seen again. In another scene that I think is very interesting, Sancho has to bring three beautiful gentlewomen, three ladies. And he goes, and of course, he goes and rounds up the first three peasant girls that he can find. They're just some girls. And rather plain. Don Quixote sees them and he says, well, what is this? I mean, I asked you to find me these beautiful women. And Sancho says, they are beautiful women, but they're under enchantment. That is, they appear plain, but their plainness is an illusion. A mirroring back of this idea that the real woman would appear plain to you, but creates an illusion of beauty. It's unreal. Here's Sancho explaining to Don Quixote, this illusion of plainness is unreal. And then finally, Dulcinea, who he fantasizes as a beautiful woman, and she too is excuse me, a rather vulgar person. Sorry, I gotta go. Anyway.